All right. So the problem with security is that you are trying to enforce a negative result. So if you're trying to enforce a negative result, i.e. you're trying to prevent something from happening, any number of things from happening, it's very difficult to do that. So if you want an outcome, a positive result, you can architect to achieve that positive result. If you want to prevent an outcome, then you have to prevent all possible results. And in that model, the defense guys are always on the chase, right? They're looking for other people. Essentially, other people in the world are crowdsourcing their security problem for them, and they are trying to fix the holes as they're found. Because it's the weakest link in the chain. And understand that every particular link in the chain can be very, very secure. But how you put the chain together can also lead to insecure implementations. All with the exception of web, we'll talk about that. But almost all of the commercial encryption standards that are out there are extremely secure. Extremely secure, but they keep getting broken over and over and over again. And it always comes down to implementation, right? If I come with a, let's take WEP for example, I have a not so good encryption engine to begin with, as far as key space is not great. And there was a number of problems with WEP, but really what the if you guys remember back to the guys that have taken encryption already, right? To be able to things are considered insecure if you can predict that one ciphertext is ciphertext versus it actually being truly random. If you can predict something is ciphertext over it being truly random, then you have issues. So WEP had that issue. It also used a nonce that was sequential and started with 0 every time you connected. So it was very predictable, right? And so there was just a number of problems with WEP. But the encryption overall, like the actual encryption primitive, while not great, was still okay, right? For being able to just do a temporary session, right? But it always comes down to the implementation details, right? You can have very secure primitives. If you put them together wrong, things go really, really bad, right? You can have AES which is very secure. Pick whichever, AES 256, very secure on both ends. If they can grab the key as it goes across in plain text, right? AES no longer is very good because the key is everything.
So if you have a new system, you would want to make sure that you implement it the correct way where avoidance is better than mitigation?
So particularly with encryption, you should never design encryption algorithms yourself. You should probably pick packages that are very well thought through. But even then, like, 802.11 with WEP went out into the wild with just ridiculously dumb scheme. And now you can just jump on, anybody can break WEP, right?
Sounds secure.
It's totally insecure. So, on the topic of WEP, so after WEP died its horrible death, and is still found out in the wild, we went into WPA2, right?
Mm-hmm.
So WPA2 tried to fix all those problems. But it's interesting from a networking perspective on how you actually manage encryption over network. So it is not a wired network, it is broadcast. So if I am going to communicate, UCCS's access point is bad, but because there's a different method for that. But let's say you have a home access point, and it has a really good password, right? And there's none of these problems that WEP had with, nonces that are sequential and blah, blah, blah. It started with 0 and predictable, right? the question is, with that scheme, how do you actually manage doing the communication if Steve wants to talk to the access point, right? And there's 5 different other you that want to talk to the access point too. Steve wants his stuff to be, he wants to talk to the access point, but he wants none of you guys to see what it is. No, you can still do it, right? So on a current home router with WPA, if everybody in this room connects to the same router, can we see each other's traffic? Well, can we decipher each other's traffic? Only tiny bit of it. We can see that you're sending to an IP address. We have to be able to see that, right? Because a router needs to know what to do with it and where to send it back to, right? So the source and destination addresses for the packet at the IP level are unencrypted, right? We can see traffic, but we can't see what's inside it. So how do you go about doing that if we are all had the same key, right? This is a home access, wireless access point, right? So your password, of course, is password, right? And we all know that it is up on, or it's at a brewery, right? Because I really liked it. And so your password is like, beer is good, right? And it's all on the wall, and we don't, and so we all have the same key. How do we still keep each other, because we don't trust each other, right? We are giving trust to the access point because once you're inside there, they can see whatever. Unless there's some other encryption on top of it, right? So how do we do that? We all have the same key.
Private communication between individuals, communicating people and
So yeah, so here's the deal. So we have some information, and we want to basically use our communication key to establish a session key, so that the session key is unique to all of us. Each of us have a unique session key, right? That way, we establish a session key with the router, right? And that we do that in a private way, which we'll discuss on how that actually happens. And then everybody else will be able to see our traffic going across, but the entire contents of the traffic, other than the source destination address, are encrypted. So, how do we send that? So now we have a client and access point, right? So the client says, hey, I want to connect to the access point, and the access point responds with what?
Sure. Knock.
Huh?
Just respond with a knock.
No. So this isn't TCP, right? So we're just sending messages back and forth. Don't really care what we call them, right? So the access point responds with a unique number, right? And that unique number is a nonce. And then the client then responds, right, with the nonce. But this is a client nonce. So client, and this is akin to the same ways of the three-way handshake, right? So we have a SYN X and a SYN Y, right? For our synchronization numbers, right? And we respond with the MAC address encrypted with the key. And then it responds.
Which key? The
The known key.
So beer is good.
Yep, it's encrypted with beer is good.
Okay.
Well, technically, it's encrypted with a hash of beer is good. Because beer is good wouldn't be very widely spread out, right? So, but a hash of beer is good is great, right? So, we take beer is good and we put it into a hash, expand it out to whatever our key size needs to be. Huh?
Hash and beer, guys.
Hash and beer. That's right. Wow, so much better today.
Boom.
And I was already happy because the election's over. So,
Did you win?
huh?
Did you
Oh,
win?
we crushed them.
Congrats.
So, you shouldn't motivate somebody that has a PhD related to data science by talking crap about his wife. Just the way it is. They made some strategic mistakes, and that was one of them. So, then so it responds with its own nonce, and then the MAC address encrypted with, the MAC address encrypted with the key. The access point responds with the MAC address encrypted. So we get the now you have the MAC address plus the nonce encrypted with the key. And
Is this the server's Mac or the client's Mac?
oh, this is the client's MAC. So it set up the MAC. He sends back the MAC encrypted with the key and the nonce that was sent.
So he's taking both the client information that got sent to him, encrypting it with the key, and passing it back. Okay.
Right, and then we also at this point distribute the key for the group. And don't worry about, this is not going to be on e-test, right? I just wanted to explain why there's all these passbacks. And then this entire thing is encrypted with a session key. And then it sends back the session key encrypted with the session key encrypting the ACK plus the MAC address. So what you do is very much like sending a message over the wire, right? You have a nonce, so the nonce can't be replayed. That's the whole point of doing a nonce. So if you respond that you have the session key, or you have the network key, right, then nobody can replay that attack because there's a nonce stuck in there, right? And you can't predict what the nonce is, yeah. And so it uses the network key to negotiate a session key. But also notice that in our networking discussions up until this entire time, it's never been just one person talking to the network. There also needs to be a group broadcast. So we all want to remain secret from each other, but we all want to talk to the access point. But there are times in our network protocols that require us to broadcast. So in that case, we need to be able to talk to each other openly, right? So the access point needs to be able to send out a broadcast, and we need to be able to send out a broadcast as well. So there's two keys, right? There is a session key that is derived from the negotiation when you first connect to the access point. And then there is a group key that is passed by the access point to all the people that are connected.
So what if somebody captures that little scenario right there?
So they could capture it, but also notice that when you capture it, the MAC address and the nonce are sent once, right? And the key is derived from that MAC address and the nonce that is sent, so it can't be replayed, and you don't know what this guy's MAC address is.
Okay.
So if you don't know what this guy's MAC address is and it can't be replayed, then you can't grab his session key. Now you could jump on.
What if you see his laptop sitting there and you know the manufacturer and you look up the first 3 of the MAC address?
Well, then it's probably a much easier play.
Okay.
But then you could build implementation stuff in there. I don't know if anybody's done that, has done that, I'm sure they have. Right? If you simply like start throwing packets,
Yeah.
right? I imagine you might be able to denial service somebody out of that, but the access point eventually has to say, we're not gonna do that, right? We're done, right?
Curious.
This is a great experiment. I wish we had stuff to experiment on here.
Me too. Yeah. Start with the university.
Let's not do that. All right. So what if we want to send information over the wire and we want to protect against the listen and tamper? So Alice talking to Bob. So the first scenario is that Alice is in fact talking to Bob, but Eve can listen. So if Eve can listen, then she can see the cryptographic text going across the network. There's some other things that she can derive that's unencrypted, like the source and destination address. They can't be encrypted. So they should be able to see that. So if A and B already have a shared key, right, and A and B aren't compromised, right, and we're just looking at wire traffic, then it becomes very easy, right? A and B can talk freely all the time that they want because they have a shared key. The problem is how do you get the shared key? So you probably don't want to try to sneak it across the wire, right, while Alice is looking. You want to be able to get this shared key across the wire without Alice being able to see it, because if she sees it, she can get all your traffic. And this shared key should probably be unique to every time you talk.
So you use math, you only share half your key.
That's the key, right? So we have 2 different types of encryption, right? We have symmetric encryption and we have asymmetric, right?
Yep.
So symmetric encryption like AES and asymmetric like RSA. AES is a 2-way function, right? So you use the same key to encrypt and decrypt. So we're back to plain text, right? So technically AES is not like DES, it's not just reverse this thing, but it doesn't matter. It's symmetric, the key both encrypts and decrypts. We use math for RSA, right? And we use math and it generates a key pair, right? It generates a public and private key pair. And in particular, RSA works on factoring very large numbers. So it turns out that factoring a very large number, and when I say very large, like 150 digits long, it's really difficult to find the factors of that number. So if you take two really big numbers, i.e. primes, and there's some unique properties to primes, particularly the number that follows a prime, that you can create a very large number out of two very large numbers, right? And it's very difficult to reverse that process. We can easily, even though they're big numbers, we could probably sit down and figure out how we're going to multiply two 75, 80, 100 digit numbers, right? We could do that in class, and a computer can do that very quickly. Factoring that takes a very long time. So it's a wonderful candidate for encryption, right? We can quickly do something in one direction, very hard to do the other way. But it's slow. It's really, really slow. So A and B could use this method to communicate. And notice Eve would never be able to see it. So what happens is A encrypts with its private or its public key. If A encrypts with its public key, then only A can read the message. If A encrypts with its private key, then anybody can read the message, right? Because its public key is just published up to anywhere. And if we do that, then A can send messages to B, and B can send messages to A that only they can read. So if B wants to talk to A, or A, I'm on this side of the board, so A wants to talk to B, it encrypts the message with B's public key, right? Goes across. Only B can read it, so EC ciphertext, right? Then if B wants to communicate with A, it communicates with A's public key, right? And then only A can read it. Notice that even though B encrypted it, once it's encrypted, even B can't read it. So this allows us to send two-way communication, right? The problem is that it's super, super, super ridiculously slow on the computer, and it takes a large amount of computation to do these things. So what is the message that we send?
We can send the session.
We send the AES key. So B says, hey, I want to use AES key. And B replies with A's public key. Boy, that sounds great to me. Right? And then there are some other things that we should think about too, is what if Eve is no longer listening, but intercepting? If E is no longer listening, but intercepting, she becomes Trudy, by the way.
Then she trades out A's message with Trudy's.
Correct.
Yes, encrypted.
Well, so A sends a message to B, right, with B's encrypted key, then she could just simply not do that, right? She can't read B's encrypted key, right? So she simply stops it and substitutes her own message, impersonating A, right, with B's, right? And so, but it turns out that we could also fix that too, right? We just need a little bit more work, right? And then you get famous and you have a protocol written after you, right? But you guys will cover that in crazy depth in your encryption class. So. There's some other problems too with Trudy, and not just sending it. What if Trudy can guess what your message is? Trudy can intercept and change things, and she can't read the messages, but she can take a really good guess. So with block encryption, you run into some problems, right? So if I encrypt a block, it's plain text that goes to cryptotext, right? And I'm sending stuff over the wire. What if let's just call this the plain text is stop, right? And then don't. If I can predict what is going across the wire in these really simple examples, but there's a lot of things that happen in network traffic that are very predictable, right? Like, huh?
NTP.
Yeah. So if it's very predictable, then and it goes across in blocks, then what if I can reorder or substitute or remove blocks out of the traffic? Right. So I send C2 C1, which is don't stop. Right, and then Trudy removes a block, and now it just says stop. Right, you end up with an opposite kind of message. So then the question is, how do you prevent that from happening?
Maybe it was someone with this.
We stick nonces in.
Can you repeat it from the beginning what's happening with G and the C?
So P is C, so P is plain text, C is ciphertext, right? There's some kind of encryption engine here with a key,
Okay.
right? Trudy here doesn't know the key, otherwise she can send anything she wants. And all she knows is she can predict what the messages are gonna be. And so what we do is we stick a nonce in it. And by the way, the nonce is actually here. We stick a nonce in there. The nonce, by the way, in this scenario is in the clear. So we say, hey, now we encrypt with the key and the nonce. And when a package arrives, the key is still secret and the nonce is public. Trudy even saw the nonce going across. That's totally fine. And then it can tell if nonce is being incremented. Bad, all right, this should be the nonce here, and this is like nonce plus 1. Right, it can tell that this thing's out of order, or something's missing. Right, we have a gap in the expected nonces. And the encryption is unique for everything that goes across. So we can not only determine sequence and order, we can also each particular block is encrypted uniquely. So we also solve a replay problem. So if Trudy, huh?
You can intercept and manipulate every packet, drop packets or whatever. Can't you just then reorder all the resulting nonces after you drop a packet?
But remember, it's being encrypted with the key and the nonce. So if you arrive with this nonce, right, and then remember this is cipher 1 1, right? So 1 sub 1 sub 1. So if another packet comes across, it will have a new nonce, and it will be the ciphertext is entirely different. So we prevent a replay attack because Trudy can't save this and then replay it for later, right? We prevent a substitution or a removal attack or reorders attacks, right? All those things are fixed. With the nonce in the clear. Why does the nonce have to be in the clear?
Because if it's encrypted and
Because it was encrypted with the nonce, right? And the receiver doesn't know what the nonce was unless you tell them. But it's really encrypted with the nonce and the key. So if it's encrypted with the nonce and the key, then that's totally fine, right? And there's simple, the implementations are not really important, but there are simple ways to append data. And remember, when you encrypt something with a key, it's not actually encrypted with the key, almost never is. It's encrypted with a hash of the key. And so it's easy to set up scenarios where you just add a particular number to your key and you get a new hash, which gives you a totally different encryption, right? All right. So the next one I want to talk about is that the first one we came up with as a class, right? What if we not trying to mess around with encryption, right? Not trying to steal keys, not trying to compromise those, right? We just don't like you and we want to shut down your network. How do you fix that?
Call it Cloudflare.
Huh? Cloudflare. That's actually one of the better solutions. So, we have Bob. We don't like Bob. The further you get away from Bob, the larger the network becomes. Right? Probably more than the doubling it like I wrote it. Right? There's many, many, many routers just getting trivially away from Bob. So, you want Bob to pay for something. You want to extort them, you want to punish them, whatever. So you go out and you get a botnet. So a botnet is just compromised hosts, right? People's home computers have terrible network security. They have terrible host security, terrible passwords. Generally, that's the if you want to look at a statistical model, that is what that field looks like. Doesn't mean that individuals can't have great host security and network security and so on and so forth, right? But as a whole, compromising random boxes, really easy, right? So you go out and you compromise a number of random boxes. It is not uncommon for this to be on the order of like 10 to 50 million different boxes. Very big botnet. And by the way, you don't even really need to do it yourself because you can rent them.
For a few Bitcoin.
Well, not even a few, because a Bitcoin right now is going for money, right? So, I mean, some small fraction of a Bitcoin, you can rent yourself some number of computers, right? So, notice that this direction, right, as an aggregate, this direction bandwidth is getting very high. As we go this direction as an aggregate towards B, it gets much smaller. So we want to flood this computer, right? And we want to turn B off. Not necessarily the host, but it can no longer communicate, right? So what we're really targeting is either the memory space in this computer to be able to open up sockets, or we're targeting this router. And we just start sending packets. Millions upon millions, billions of packets, right? As they come down here, right, the queues fill up, bad things start happening. Also notice that our quality of service model doesn't really help us in this, because we got a million flows on this side from a million different computers, right? And so our quality of service model isn't making this any better either. So if we had one big computer on this side we wanted to punish Bob, that's a different model. Our quality of service model fixes that. Because you would have our virtual queues that we talked about last week, right, for all of our flows, and it would simply fill up X's and it would just start dropping packets.
Yeah, but you say queues are based off flow, not.
Yeah, if
Original.
you had one big X.
Or if you just had parallel flows.
Okay, so then you could have parallel flows, But instead of looking at it as a flow, look at it as parallel flows with the same source. So, source 1, 2, and 3. So we're gonna say, hey, our queuing model, we're gonna upgrade our queuing model a little bit and say, hey, we're not just gonna count flows, right? After a certain number of flows, we're gonna count source addresses. Right? You are taking up too much of my network, not just your flow. So we can do that. In the old method, you simply lied about your source address. So instead of X, you said, hey, I'm Y, and Z, and A and B and C, right? You just lied about your source address. So that doesn't work very well anymore, because most of that stuff is blocked at the IP. So when you run into, when big X is sending stuff into its giant pipe into the ISP checks each packet for not only where it needs to route for the destination, it also checks where it needs to route for the source. And then says, hey, is this port the same as it arrived from? It's a super simple check. The router already does that quickly. Right, so the router has hardware built in it to be able to route packets to whatever address. So it simply checks both the source and the destination, and so does it see the source arrive at the same place that it said it was, right? If it doesn't, just drop it. So, but in the old days, that's what we did, is you would lie about your source. So in the old days, you could also do this. So instead of X sending everything to B, X would use this giant pipe to send it to A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, and you would send it connection request and lie about your source address. Right? So then A sends a connection request, a SYN packet, right? And what does A do?
It responds to B.
It sends a SYN ACK to B. Right? And you could reflect your TAC off other computers.
And amplify it.
Huh?
And amplify it.
There are ways to amplify it too.
I'm curious how many ISPs actually do that, because reflection attacks are still a thing.
They still work.
They still work-ish if you can find somebody with a misconfigured NTP server or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't seem like ISPs are all that great at turning on the bit that enforces that.
From the ISP's level, there's not a great incentive for them to do that. So this type of model is like the vaccination model. It all works if we all do it, right? So when the ISP invests this money, they're not protecting themselves, they're protecting somebody else, right? So it's a hard model to push forward economically. And remember, they're not buying $100 routers. It's not what they're buying is ridiculously expensive equipment, right? So, the best model for this, how do we fix this?
The routers keep track of how many things are sending to one address.
But where?
I mean, so if a
Every
SYNAC
step.
comes in without a outbound
Yeah.
SYN.
Oh, so not just the reflection attack, right? How do we just protect from the flooding? It doesn't matter, like, we're flooding this network.
Every router is checking, and if it crosses a certain threshold, they just start saying that.
Just start
Throw it
dropping.
on the ground.
Yeah, we could do that.
Otherwise, we can.
But remember, if you do that, so poor little A wants to communicate. Because this is HBO. And it's Sunday night. Right? So poor little A wants to communicate. how do you distinguish A from all of these guys?
You don't.
You don't, right? So, how do we fix that?
So another thing that can be done is we can simulate. There was a paper I read that actually used a moving target. So for B, it's going to create another instance of B. And since it's mostly from one attacker, the flows are going to be similar. So you can categorize those flows and send them to another.
Honeypots.
And even ISPs use BGP, right?
Uh-huh.
To just ground
Yeah.
flows.
We create many bees all over the network, right? Commercially, we call this Cloudflare, right? And so we do a content delivery network, right? So early on, we said, how do we manage? Like, it had to be like in the second, at the latest third week of class, was how do we manage flows from data from going across the network, right? One of the things was, hey, let's copy all the data close to poor little A here, right? And then when A requests data, then we go that direction, right? So if, I think I drew a model up on it like here. I had like 4, and I told you it's like, well, it crosses the network here 3 times, right? And if we want to do this 4 different times, now we're at 12 hops, right? And taking easy measurements of just whatever. So now it's at 12. What if we move everything here first, right? Which takes 2 hops, right? And then the 4 other times takes 4, and then we get 6, right? So this is the concept of a content delivery network, right? Where we move the data closer to the requester. Well, essentially we could do that, right? So if we have a attachment to this router with some kind of storage space, right, then we can simulate B here, right? And then when A requests it, it comes up here, goes to this one, back to this one to B, yay, right? Didn't arrive here, this is our congestion area. But we can do that everywhere.
Is that
Right.
the same concept of the fog computing?
Huh?
Fog computing?
I haven't heard of that one. Fog?
Yeah.
Is it similar?
It's similar.
So the idea is we can identify areas of congestion and move our data other places. Right? So now B is over here for A. But down here, if X is still attacking and then C comes online and wants to get to B, well, X is attacked, there's only 2 lines here, right? And this 3, we're no longer congested here, right? This one is taking all these attacks off, right, as we go along, and we divide it up. So remember, the problem with the distributed denial of service was that bandwidth was high this direction and it was low this direction. If we start distributing the content everywhere, then we no longer have this funneling problem. Now you need to find a very specific botnet in a very specific network, right? Which actually there are other ways to deal with that, right? Because it's easier to model traffic coming from one place. But DDoS is still an ongoing research area. There's no great, what you're doing in DDoS is taking advantage of the network's distributed nature, right? Each individual node in the network views itself only in terms of its neighbors and has no big picture of the network. And if you have no big picture of the network, then it is possible to take advantage of that lack of sight to do things like this, right? So the denial of service is still out there, still Anonymous uses it a lot. But for the big content providers where you can move your data around, it makes it much easier. Doesn't mean that somebody can't do distributed denial you. Right? Because you can't really, on a client side, your computer really is where it is, right? You're physically attached to it, whether it's you're holding it in if it's a phone, or you're sitting at a desk if it's a laptop or whatever, right? But you can't magically transport yourself, to the other side of the United States to get away from your distributed denial service tag, right? So it only works for the content, because you can simply move your content. So there's no person at a server sitting there having to reply for your Google request. Still lots of research in that area. How do you fix that? Because then when you're modeling data trying to shut it down, right, the attacker can simply change what the data looks like. Right, and then you're like, well, this is coming too regularly. You can model data by looking at how regular it is, right? Well, it's simply introduce randomness, right?
Slow it down, speed it up.
Slow it down, speed it up. Have random times between packets, right? Have random different packets. Have a giant library of packets, right?
If your attacker's really motivated, make it look like legit traffic, like actual HTTP requests.
Correct, yes. Varied HTTP requests, right? So that you can't even do like modeling for shutting down, right? If the HTTP request looks the same every time it comes to wire, then you can use modeling to say, that's done. We're gonna stop that one for a while, right? But if it looks varied every time it comes across, what do you model? Well, if it's varied, you model the timing. And then if they vary the timing, what do you model after that? Right? And then, in this model, how do you determine A from X? Because if you shut off A, then the X is achieving its goal also. It was the idea was to shut off A anyway.
This is why Akamai, Arbor, and Cloudflare make giant piles of money.
Giant piles of money. Yep. All right.
Seems difficult to ever get ahead in security.
Huh?
It seems difficult to ever get ahead in security.
Never ending pile of money.
So
That's not good.
That's why it's good to be.
job in cybersecurity is my village.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I mean,
Yeah, I saw your.
by definition, you're always on defense, so. Oh, you are?
Yeah.
No.
I just need a presentation slide because I just put them all queued up.
Probably not gonna go.
I'm not scheduled for Monday, but I'll send you all my stuff.
Just in
If there's a
case?
Spot, yeah.